Hello, good afternoon everyone. Because today's program is held in conjunction with the exhibition Ever Present, First Peoples Art of Australia, I'm going to begin now with an Acknowledgement of Country, which has been written for us by National Gallery of Australia and allows us to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country from where the artworks in Ever Present have travelled. We respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country where each First Nations artist resides, or where the art in Ever Present was created. We recognise their continuing connections to country, community and culture, and pay our respect to their elders, leaders and artists, past and present. We respectfully acknowledge all First Nations traditional custodians whose art we are currently exhibiting in Singapore. Good afternoon everyone, and thank you so much for joining us here at National Gallery Singapore today. For this panel presentation. We really appreciate your interest and your time. My name's Phoebe Scott. I'm a senior curator at National Gallery and one of the collaborating curators on the exhibition Ever Present. It's a great pleasure today to introduce two fascinating and brilliant speakers, Professor Lynette Russell, who's travelled from Melbourne to be with us, and Dr Lily Yulianti Farid, who's based in both Melbourne and Makassar. And I'll introduce them more fully in just a moment. But the subject of today's panel is something that's also very important to the exhibition itself. So when we jointly developed aspects of the exhibition for the iteration of Ever Present in Singapore, one of the things that we all really hoped to emphasise was the history of direct connection with Southeast Asia, or between Southeast Asia and the First Nations of Australia. And if you visited the exhibition, you'll see how this specific connection comes out, especially in Singtel Gallery 2 of the show upstairs, where one of the historical connections that's highlighted is the trade in trepang from traders departing the port of Makassar and arriving in Northern Australia and spending time with communities there. And it's so profound to think of this network of relationships, which was quite different in the past to what the national boundaries or even our concept of region might suggest today. And I think looking more deeply at this history really allows us to kind of critically rethink our understanding of region as well. So it's with that spirit in mind and with that kind of context of the exhibition that I'm very excited about what the speakers will be presenting this afternoon. So first, let me introduce them more fully. Professor Lynette Russell, AM, is a descendant of the Wodjabalac people, an award-winning historian based at Monash University, and Australian Research Council Kathleen Fitzpatrick Laureate Fellow. She's a widely published author specialising in Aboriginal history, and she's held fellowships at both Oxford and Cambridge universities, and is an elected member of several learned academies in Australia and Britain. Her work focuses on developing an anthropological approach to the story of the past, and her historical interests are far-ranging across multiple areas and subjects, from Aboriginal people in the maritime industry to museum exhibitions, art and material culture. Her current project examines the past 1,000 years of Australian Indigenous encounters with outsiders from Southeast Asia, Europe and the Pacific. So a subject of great significance for us here today. Dr Lily Yulianti Farid is a published author and art event producer with expertise in cultural links between Australia and Indonesia. She's a postdoctoral research fellow at Global Encounters, Monash University, Australia. Her research interests include pre-colonial contacts between Australia and Indonesia, as well as gender and media in Indonesia. She's the founder and director of Makassar International Writers Festival and co-director of Rumata Art Space. Before pursuing her PhD, Lily also worked as a journalist at the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. So they've prepared two very interesting presentations for us today about different aspects of this relationship of exchange and different aspects of their current ongoing research project. So they're going to present one after the other, and then after that we'll have some time for a kind of discussion and Q&A from the floor as well. Okay, I think that's all we really need to say about that. So I'll invite Professor Lynette Russell to the stage.
Thank you very much, Phoebe, and thank you everybody for coming and for inviting us here to speak about something that we're incredibly passionate about and excited about, this project, this big project we're working on. As Phoebe just mentioned, it's customary in Australia to start with an acknowledgement of country. And I'm just going to say that I acknowledge that I wrote this paper on the lands of the Kulin people of Naarm, which we now know as Melbourne, Australia. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. You may hear from time to time that the occupation of Australia goes back 65,000 years. For Aboriginal people, it's quite simply forever. Over that great time depth, a range of cultural groups and types developed. There's massive diversity in Australia. I come from the Watchabullock people of Western Victoria. They're a desert people. There were, at first contact, when the Europeans first arrived, over 600 different tribal groups and more than 260 different languages spoken. Australia has always been an island, or as the geographers prefer to call it, a water-bound continent. The peopling of Australia, the Indigenous people, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on the coast, are a saltwater people. Their engagement, spiritual, ritual and economic, is with the sea. Much of my work over the last 30 years, it's hard to imagine, but over the last 30 years, has been framed by a desire to decentre and undermine the importance of Europe in our history, particularly Britain. For many people outside of Australia, there is a perception that Australia was a highly isolated continent. As a general rule, we are land-focused. We see the ocean, the vast ocean, as a barrier. But of course, for sea people, it's almost certainly seen as a highway or even a bridge. When contemplating travel across the oceans, I try and closely align my thinking to the ways in which sailors might have seen the ocean and their travels across it. What did they sail in? What did they take on board? What animals, food, plants, water? What trade goods? What family groups? And importantly, did they sail in one direction or two? Did they return home? Did their stories encourage others to set sail? And although some of these sailors took place 65,000 years ago, these are questions I think are really worth asking. If there's one thing most people think they know about early Australia, is that the continent remained suspended in an unchanging isolation for thousands of years before the arrival of the convicts and the First Fleet in 1788. As if we were cut off from humanity ever since the end of the last ice age, Aboriginal people living generation for generation in a hazy, mythic stasis called the Dreamtime, which over the passage of years, even the notion of history itself has no practical meaning. This is the depiction, a pure, pristine existence, where the first Australians are considered to be part of the land rather than living off it or even exploiting it. When the British arrived, they claimed the continent. There is so much wrong with this portrait of pre-contact Australia. It lumps together those hundreds of tribes and dozens of major language groups into one undifferentiated mass. It conflates the lives lived in an almost infinite variety of landscapes, from the deserts, the red centre, the lushness of the tropical north, and it perverts the rich and complex mythologies, turning what we might inadequately call the dreaming into nothing more than a synonym for the period before Captain Cook and then the First Fleet. Most dangerously of all, it imposes a striking limitation on Indigenous Australians, insisting that they were pure, making them primitive, sketching them as absolutely isolated, and encouraging us, the rest of it, the world, to think of them as an alien people, barely capable of interacting with the rest of the world. But Australia was never, ever cut off from the rest of the world. There is vast evidence of frequent contact with the people of New Guinea, and then beginning in the 17th century, sporadic encounters with the Dutch, the French, the Portuguese and the Spanish, along our western and northern coasts. But most remarkably of all, it's the Aboriginal people of Northern Australia, what Australians now call the top end, where for several centuries at least, part of a vibrant and extensive trading system brought them into annual contact with seagoing merchants from Indonesia and linked them to the civilisations as far away as China and Japan. It's another perception that Australia is a long way from everywhere else. But one of the reasons I love this map, it's a Dutch map from the 19th century, and it builds on the 17th and 18th century maps that the Dutch undertook of the region. And what I love about this map is if you look down in the middle and towards over there on the, I guess what I would call the left-hand corner, that's the top of Australia. And it's really a stone's throw from Southeast Asia. The known European exploration of Australia began in 1606 when the Dutch navigator Janszoon arrived in the Cape York Peninsula in October of that year. And then the Spanish explorer Luis Vaz de Torres sailed through the straits that now bear his name. The Dutch, French, Spanish and Portuguese voyagers from the 16th century onwards, alongside those Makassan and Chinese merchant maritime economic networks, all touched Northern Australia. But what were the Makassans coming for? The Makassans are usually a polyglot group of people. They may have originated in Makassar, but it's almost certainly a group of people who contained various other ethnicities and other nations on their boats. The Makassan fishers visited the North Australian coastline annually to collect trepang or terepang in Indonesian. These are edible sea cucumbers, also known as bêche de mer or sea slugs. The processing of trepang involved collecting, boiling, drying and then smoking before storage and transportation to Makassar. The first proper European description of the trade begins with Matthew Flinders. Matthew Flinders, relying on the extraordinary expertise of his compatriot on the boat, Bungaree, encountered on his voyage around circumnavigating Australia, which is a voyage that took 2 years, 1801 to 1803, they encountered a Malay man, or a Malay-speaking man, Pobasso. Pobasso told him that he had been coming to Northern Australia for many decades, working with particularly Yolngu people and working along the Northern Australian coasts in the trepang industry. He was sketched by one of the artists on the ship, and then later that beautiful portrait was painted of him looking out to sea where there's a great series of clouds, probably monsoon or rain, on its way. The trepangers left Makassar around December with the western monsoon. The fishers would soon work the trepang grounds of Northern Australia until March and April, and they would then return home on the east trade winds. These fishers sailed their prows, sailed their prows or their ships to the Northern Australian coastal waters, spending time in Arnhem Land and the Gulf of Carpentaria and the Kimberley in Western Australia. They never travelled across, at the best of our knowledge, across to Torres Strait, as far as we know. From at least the 1700s onwards, and our project would suggest maybe even quite significantly earlier than that, from at least the 1700 onwards until the closing of the industry, to our great shame, in 1907, when Australia instituted something called the White Australia Policy, the trepang industry was controlled by Makassans working with other men from Southeast Asian ports and trading out of Makassar in Sulawesi. For the Makassans, the Australian coastline was known as Kayu Jawa and Marage. We know about the Makassan tree-pang processing sites from archaeological work. They're often identified by stone fireplaces, traces of smokehouses, tamarind trees in particular. In Arnhem Land, tree-pang processing sites are often characterised by what's called stone lines and hearths constructed so that the tree-pang could be boiled in cauldrons. There's fire pits as well. The tree-pang were buried after boiling, and the circular traces of the smokehouses, along with the trees, as I said, the tamarind trees, scatters of cultural material, shell, bone, glass, metal, pottery. All of this indicates the presence of tree-pang fissures. In the Kimberley, 800 kilometres to the west, a large tree-pang processing site was at a bay called Tamarinda, known to local people as the beach. I won't even try to pronounce the language term, it's really beyond my tongue. The beach with black stones. These sites can be very challenging to identify. I don't know about you, if I came across that in the bush, I'd probably not realise that it was a significant site. They are a challenge, but many archaeologists have identified them and investigated them, as they have seasonal beach camps. Often crews stayed months at a time, sometimes just a few days or weeks in each location. Some locations were used year after year. Other evidence of the visits include Asian pottery sherds, glass, coins, metal fish hooks, clay smoking pipes, fragments of metal. The tree-pang industry was dependent on the Chinese market, in particular the addition of sea cucumbers to the Makassan crews collected with other trade goods, which is how it really started off. They were out looking for turtle and pearl shell, ironwood and beeswax. These sustained trade activities over centuries resulted in strong social and cultural relationships with the local people, most particularly the Yolngu of Eastern Arnhem Land. According to Yolngu oral tradition, when the Makassans arrived on the coast, they would look out for fluttering flags, and to this day you'll see fluttering flags on Yolngu land. We also know extensively about what these campsites looked like from beautiful 19th century lithographs and sketches. And I've just got a couple here that I'm just going to show you. You can see there the big cauldron boiling away. Aboriginal people also depicted Indonesian visitors in rock art. Yolngu men built stone pictures representing prows and tree-pang fishers in fireplaces. These depictions reflect extensive Aboriginal knowledge of the Makassan world, and they materialise the memories of shared experiences of the fishing era. The British, the Dutch, the Indonesian and other European records suggest the tree-pang visits commenced in the 17th century, as I mentioned before. But there is some significant, perhaps tantalising clues that it might even be earlier. For example, on Groote Island, there was some pottery found that is thought to date to perhaps 800 years ago. And perhaps one of the most well-established pieces of research was done in Torres Strait, where although we know that Makassans themselves didn't travel there, or we think they didn't travel there, there was indeed a 16th century Chinese sherd of pottery found at the excavation on the site of Gumu village, which suggests that perhaps Southeast Islanders and Southeast Asian traders, particularly Chinese traders, were in the Coral Sea at the time. So these small shared moments become the hints by which we might be able to understand Australia's tie to the spice route and the silk route trade systems, because while we know that they were out looking for tree-pang, the tree-pang was actually traded into a network that included silks and silver and, of course, spices. And I'm going to now hand over to Lily.
Thank you, Lynette. And hi, everyone. Selamat sore. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I'm from Makassar, but now I'm living and working at Narm or Melbourne. the traditional lands of the colonisation. It always was, and it always will be. So my name is Lily. I'm from Makassar. I was born and grew up in Makassar, and it's such a privilege to be here to share the history between people from Makassar with First Peoples in Northern Australia. So for Singaporeans, the word Bugis is probably more familiar compared to Makassar, isn't it? Yes, here you have Bugis Street, you have Kampung Bugis, there's a Bugis Junction, Bugis MRT station, and of course that sweet delicacy called Bugis. Enak ya? So, however, in our talk today, we are focusing on Makassans, as explained by Professor Lynette Russell, that this is actually a terminology that widely used to describe a group of people who set sail from the port of Makassar. In modern Indonesia, Makassar is the capital of South Sulawesi province, to coastal areas of northern part of Australia to catch and process tripang. These people were Makassaris, Buginis, Samabajo, perhaps some Malay people, or Makassar and Chinese descendants, because Chinese people and Chinese community been living in Makassar under the kingdom of Goa and Talo for many ages before this tripang trade started, and also people from other islands in East Indonesia. And they both called Padewakang, or later on adopted as prau in English. So the shared history and the influence of Makassans in Australia has also inspired artistic expressions. So today's talk, I'm looking at these artistic expressions from painting, songs, literary works, and performances. For example, Makassan people and objects associated with tripang trade have become characteristics of many artworks in Yolngu community, from Makassan prau, or the traditional boats, tripang processing camps, canoes, and so on. Let's start with the word of domala. This is domala, the sail, or layar perahu in Bahasa Indonesia. This year, senior artist from Yirkala Northeast Amhenland, Margaret Raru Garawura, is the winner of Telstra National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Art Awards, or NATSIA. This award is the richest art award in the country, with the overall prize pool doubling to an incredible $190,000 Australia, or equals with Singaporean dollars. Margaret took out the coveted Telstra Art Award this year and received $100,000 with her incredible 2.8-meter hand-woven sail, or domala, pandanus sail. The story behind the sail or behind this layar is very important and interesting, because Margaret says Yolngu people were watching Makassar people weaving their domala from time to time. Then they started to make them. My father picked up the skills as well. He used to make them. Makassan domala. Makassan domala, or layar perahu, is a part of their life. I was watching my father making this. He was making them and I was watching, keep watching, and I learned. I thought about how he made them, my father, and I started remembering. And now I'm making domala. Oops. So we go. Okay, so the next artist that I would like to introduce here also has a really interesting stories as a part of her family. Sometimes in the late 19th century, an indigenous man from Anham land named Damalacha Yunupingu visited Makassar. After returning to northern Australia, he shared a story about Makassan women making cloth by inserting 2 sticks of bamboo and stringing cotton thread between them. This story has inspired his son, named Mangarui Yunupingu, to paint one of the very remarkable and important artwork in this shared history called Malay Women Weaving. This is an artwork produced in 1948. This artwork depicts the family stories, First Nation peoples' mobility, and global encounters. The next generation from this family, Dambit Munungur, this is Dambit, continues the legacy. Painting the encounters, keep producing artworks to share the stories of the encounters between Makassans and her great-great-grandfathers and the rest of the family and community. This artwork here, very beautiful one, is one of her latest work entitled Makassan and Yongu, produced in 2021. It was commissioned by the National Gallery of Victoria in Melbourne for an exhibition called Can We All Have a Happy Life as a part of the Triennale 2022-2021. So for First Nation artists, Makassan influences have enriched their creativity and insights. As anthropologist Howard Morphy notes, on artworks and other artistic expressions by Yongu artists. Morphy says, Makassan influence does not disrupt Yongu belief systems or the core relationships between the people and the land. Makassan become part of an Aboriginal history of place rather than imposing their own history and identity on Aboriginal land, or in this context, on Anham land. So, one of the keywords to understand the First Nation people's art in the context of their encounters and their relationship with Makassans is incorporation, meaning that they incorporate the external influences to enrich their art practices. If we look at the encounters between Makassan and First Peoples in North Australia, we might ask whether the shared history is well known in Makassar, as the thread and familial ties had been established for at least 300 years. However, unlike in Australia, traces of these encounters in Makassar or in Indonesia in general are difficult to find. We sometimes jokingly say that it's just a footnote in our mainstream history. There are various factors involved in the lack of information about the shared history in Makassar or elsewhere in Indonesia, including the absence of this story in our school textbook or in our history books, and the insufficient materials and narratives on this topic in provincial, city, and national museums and galleries. Historical and art projects initiated by Australian historians and artists, however, this is a good news, have filled the gap in learning about this shared history. One of the remarkable projects was the commemorative voyage of a traditional boat named Hati Marege in 1988-1989, sailing from Makassar to Marege, or Yirkala, and initiated by a Darwin-based historian, Peter Spilett. Hati Marege project opened opportunities for the art collaborations between Makassans and First Nation peoples in the coming years. So let's have a look here. This is a timeline of several collaborations in Makassar, meaning that where the indigenous artists visiting Makassar and establish collaborations with the local artists in Makassar. Not many actually happening here. If you look at the timeline, for example, so we have students from Bachelor College visited Makassar in 1986. It was the first reunion after the trade was disbanded by the new regulations issued by the Australian government in 1906 and 1907. So it could be said that the connections between China, Makassar, and Australia, especially northern part of Australia, abruptly stopped by the white people's regulation in the early 20th century. And the first reunion took place in 1986 when a group of students from Bachelor College outside Darwin visited Makassar to find whether they could actually reconnect with their families in Makassar. And the project, the Hati Marige project, started in 1987, but the sale took place in 1988. And we have to wait 10 years later before another Australian initiative came under the umbrella of project called Opera Tripang. And it was in 1997 and 2003. There's another small but quite remarkable project by Julie Jensen. It's called the Crocodile Hotel. And then another small project in Makassar in 2013. And one of the most important projects that attract 5,000 people in Makassar happened in 2014 when Guru Mul, the First Nations singer from Australia, performed at Makassar Jazz Festival. So from a small project, from a big project like the one that happened in 2014, what we learned from this timeline is that there are some characteristics. The main characteristic of these collaborations are, first, they're all initiated by non-Indigenous Australians, white Australians who have learned about the history. They played these roles as producers or organizers. And the next character is the involvement of First Peoples from communities, their artists and performers, and the involvement of Makassan artists and performers. And last but not least, this is one of the unique characteristics of the art collaborations, is that the family of the last Tripangers from Makassar were also involved in all these projects. So in recent years, there's an exciting development where indigenous organizations such as Buku Langgai Mulka Center in Yirkala has become an initiator for several projects with Indonesian artists, including the one that took place in 2017 called Bujum. In 2018 and 2019, a more comprehensive project involving artist exchange program, an international symposium, exhibition, and documentary film called Trading Cultures was launched. This project was initiated by Professor Richard Frankland, an Aboriginal Australia of Gunditj Mara origin from Victoria. He's a playwright, musician, scriptwriter. And this project, organized by Williams Centre, VCA University of Melbourne, funded by DFAT Australia through Australia Indonesia Centre at Monash, Indonesia. So here I share some pictures. If you look at this, the first pictures, it was the early project that a part of the Tripang opera. And then the second picture is the trading cultures that took place in Yirkala and in Makassar. And these are some pictures of the collaboration projects as a part of the Opera Tripang and also as the continuation of the Hatima Reggae project. And here, the Bujung project that initiated by the Yirkala Buku Center at Yirkala. So, the Bujung project itself, it was an idea coming from the center in Yirkala and a local artist, Abdi Karya, who really think about how art could serve as the best way to represent this connection. So they call this kind of like the clay pots from Takalar and Makassar. These clay pots were made in Indonesia, in Makassar, and then they sent all these clay pots to Yirkala, and the local artists at the center painted all these clay pots, and after they painted all these clay pots, they sent them back to Makassar and said that, let's see, if we have all the clay pots in a 100% perfect condition, or perhaps some of them, or maybe all of them, would be arrived as broken pieces. But we received these clay pots like this. Well, we paid an insurance, but we've got some broken pieces here. So we decided to prepare the exhibition as a part of Trading Cultures project and call them as Unbroken Friendship. So stories of Tripangers provide narratives about global context in pre-independence Indonesia, especially with Makassar and South Sulawesi, and pre-colonial Australia. Art collaborations between the two countries and between Australia and South Asia will be increasingly important to disseminate these narratives. This is more pictures from the trading culture, and these are very unique collaborations because the Victoria College of the Arts from University of Melbourne decided to send a researcher, Daniel Belt from VCA, to just to observe the change, the perceptions, the imaginations, and the story that they shared during the artist residency. And we also invited one of the project officers, a female project officers, to become the part of this Trading Cultures project for 7 months. And this is the one of the artists from Makassar's works, Abi Nur Abdiansa. It's called the Lost Makassan. Is Abi here? Yeah, if you watch the show Ever Present, that's Abi's at the back. Abi's video installations is also part of the Ever Present's exhibitions. And Gunawan Adi, one of the artists who participated in Trading Cultures project, produced a very interesting artwork. It's called Sharing the Sunset. It's quite a sad story because it depicts the last encounters and the final farewell when both sides, the Yolngu people and the Makassan Tripangers, learned about the new regulations which issued in 1906 and 1907. So the artist explains that I leave it as a white paper, no color needed, because it's up to us today's generations to continue this story and put color on this Sharing the Sunset. To conclude my presentation, allow me to present our recent project. This is a song, a duet between the greatest First Nation singer Gurumul, the late Gurumul, with Makassan female singer Dian Mega Savitri. The song entitled Bayini. In Makassaris language, Bayini means women. And for Yolngu community, Bayini stays forever as the guardian spirit who looks after the land and the people of Yolngu. Sang in Yolngu language and Makassaris language, produced by Mart Grus from Skinny Fish and myself. Enjoy and thank you.
You can see I didn't get the memo about what colour we were supposed to wear today. I'm going to take the grey chair. So, Professor Russell, Dr Lily Yulianti Farid, thank you so much. Two such rich and fascinating presentations. I think so much history and context to grapple with, as well as so many sort of inspiring ideas as well. So I'm going to open to the floor for questions in just a moment, but there's a few I'd like to ask to get the ball rolling a little bit. My first question, and maybe it's really something about a bit broader than your project, but I was really struck as we were going through your slides, Dr. Lily, that there was one really curious image, a bark painting from Yirrkala from 1948, and it had a descriptive title of Malay Women Weaving. And this is quite surprising in a way, because clearly female weavers are not going to be travelling as part of the trepang trade. So to me, it opened up, this interesting train of thought about the bigger question of the maritime contacts between Southeast Asia and the northern coast of Australia. So we kind of hear now about the story from the port of Makassar specifically and this trade. And yet, if you look at the map, there's so many other Southeast Asian port cities in touching distance from this region of Australia. And when we think about the seafaring populations of Southeast Asia who move nomadically throughout the archipelago, it seems impossible that they wouldn't have also had kind of other types of contact with this northern coastline. So I sort of wanted to ask about this, what do you think about this possibility, about the idea of, not just the Yolngu areas, but perhaps that whole northern coast, and the general sense of this very active maritime network extending, beyond Makassar to other ports or, from other kind of groups and trades?
Thank you. I totally agree. I think there's what we're grappling with is a lack of evidence because we don't have texts and we don't have, necessarily sites that would indicate this. But there's no reason to assume that people, for example, from the Aru Islands, from Ambon, didn't come into Northern Australia. And it's pretty clear to me that when we have things like, we have all these things in Australia that they're called, sort of unexpected finds or unusual finds. We have coins in Northern Australia that came from Tanzania. We have coins that have come from Indonesia. We have Chinese coins and we have some Chinese ceramics. I think these are probably indicative of an extensive trade network. It might have been sporadic, but I think there's definitely connections across Northern Australia. Australia wasn't isolated the way the history books have, for some strange reason, have decided to write it.
And I presume within First Nations communities, there's also cultural knowledge of other relations as well that perhaps hasn't been brought out as explicitly by the surviving material record, for example. But yeah, did you have anything you wanted to?
Yes, if you look at the records, examples, as we explained earlier, that whenever we use the terminology of Makassans, it tells you about a group of people that set sails, but it's a multicultural, people from different ethnic backgrounds. And if you look at the Makassar during this time of period. This is such a busy port. And what do you expect from a busy port? You'll find Chinese communities, Indian communities, Arab communities, and with the local peoples, and then they all actually come together, and then we just identify them that, oh, they all people come from Makassar. And there's one fascinating story about these Malay women weaving artwork, because unlike other artworks that tells or depict stories about people from outside Australia that came to, and then they the cultural or objects that they used normally sprau and the tripengers, of course they're all male tripengers, and then the context and the interactions with the locals, they're all men. But when you have one artwork with women as a center or an object of this artwork, I start to think that, oh, there's no women come from Makassar, because in our culture, in Buginese culture, in South Sulawesi, West Sulawesi, women are and the oceans are enemy. I mean, like, well, all women's job are to wait for the husbands, brothers, and sons, coming from the oceans, and while they're waiting, they're weaving. And that's actually the story of mobility, the First Nation people's mobility. That there's a story about a man from Yirkala or Northeast Amhan land in the 19th century visited Makassar, maybe alone, maybe together, 2 or 3 people. But there's an evidence, there's a photograph that widely circulated globally about young teenagers, Aboriginal young teenagers, roaming around the city of Makassar. And there's also a very interesting stories from British Museum, where there's some. Was it from Norway or Finland? It's from European researcher bought a spear and then sold this spear or other material culture to the British museums in the late 19th century and said, this is all made by Makassans. But 50 years later, British Museum had to actually apologize and say, sorry, it's all coming from Yolngu people. They're all made in Australia, made by the First Nation peoples. So for me, it's just a simple logic things when we talk about BC ports across Southeast Asia, and if we take it in a broader perspective, BC ports in this region, in Asia and Australia. And when Lynette saw us the Dutch map, we can actually feel, oh, we're that close actually. Exactly. And there's another thing about the idea of isolations. This is actually such a perspective coming from Westerners, yeah, isolated community and so forth. Regina Ganter once said, you know what happened with people in Northern Australia, the indigenous people in Australia? They actually are part of global networks before the British took over the continent. And the episode of the isolation started in 1906, 1907, when the British government launched this new regulation to say to Makassan tripengers, you no longer allowed to enter our waters.
So actually the isolation is a product of the colonial policy, not predating it. And I think that point is so crucial that you just made as well. So Lynette in her opening talked about this kind of image of Australian history as an isolated continent. And that wasn't just about people coming in, but it also created this idea that First Nations people didn't go out, didn't traverse the borders either, which obviously, is an error. And I wanted to ask you a bit more about that, because you mentioned all the communities in the busy port of Makassar, and I believe, perhaps you can correct me if I'm wrong, but there's also evidence in Makassar and other parts of South Sulawesi of diasporic Aboriginal communities too, who had settled there. Is there something you can say a bit more about that?
Yes, 2 weeks ago, I had an interview with one community leader from Elko Island, because he's also working with the same label in Darwin, Skinny Fish, who produced this Gurumol's duet project with working with different languages. So in this interview, he said that, you know what, I decided to make a solo trip to Makassar in 1997, and there is no record about this because I keep it for myself and say, oh, never heard about that. I know that a group of bachelor's college students from Darwin actually, visited Makassar in 1986, and I said, yes, I came a year after that. I was inspired by the reunion, and I really wanted to visit my grandmother graveyards in Makassar. And I asked, oh, did you visit your grandmother graveyard? Yes, it's at the back of the house. And I said, where's the house? Oh, it's gone. So again, it's all about the evidence, because they would. Peter Spilett, the historians from Darwin, actually recorded that there were two graveyards, two graveyards that identify as Aboriginal graveyards in Kampong Baru. Kampong Baru is is a kind of like waterfront area in Makassar. Nowadays, there's a big private hospitals in this area. So people just say, well, before this is all happening, we know that we have the two people from Marege that stayed. They married here. They have a husband and children, and then they have graveyards here. But it's very hard. It's very like we rely on a lot of oral histories and family histories. Of course, there's challenge here because sometimes there's an inconsistency in terms of dates and years. For example, we revisited these old records about when actually the first visit happened or took place, and there's an old people living in this kampong area or the waterfront area told Peter Spilett in 1977. I'm a bit difficult with years. 1977, saying that, well, it's not far from the war. So it's a Makassan War, yeah? So when, the Dutch, with support from the Bugis kingdom called Raja Bone, launched this big war called Makassan War. People who actually didn't, want to accept that now this area was under the Dutch control, tried to seek refugees and move, starting this a huge diasporic movement to everywhere across the regions. And that's actually one assumption. Well, Campbell McNair doesn't like this idea.
No.
But there is for me, this Strait, why Makassan had to go to the top end Australia, is just merely because economic reason, right? And during the war and post-war situations, there's so many chaotic circumstances happening in South Sulawesi back then. So it's just a simple logic that people need to move to find, a new economic resources. And it was actually that time when the tripang demand was really high in China, especially in South China. Yeah.
Well, one last question from me, which is also about the idea of evidence. So, in your timeline, you kind of presented the idea that contact was cut in 1906, and that was cut kind of at a political level, part of the White Australia policy. And then from the Makassan side, the revival of contact begins with also kind of institution-driven projects. The college students, some of the kind of commemorative projects that are perhaps funded by Australian arts funding or kind of diplomatic initiatives. But I suppose those are all well documented. But what about, is there a sense of continuing informal contact on the Makassan side? Continuing visits that sort of slip the net of the policing of those borders, or the kind of official severing of that relationship?
Yes. If you look at the media reports, for example, ABC keep reporting about these illegal fishings, from Indonesia. But apart from these illegal fishings as a mainstream news, we could actually find one or two news articles from the Australian media that telling us about the familial visit. They visit the family. They try to find their great grandmother and great grandfather's graveyards in Australia. Yeah. So back then it was in 2007 or 2000 early 2010. One of the reports actually suggested that it was really strange because according to the range. From the national park rangers, the bush rangers say that this is uncommon. We normally listened about or learned about these, illegal fishermen from Makassar or from other part of East Indonesia, especially Kupang. But this time, we saw footprints of people in the bush and forest. They didn't go for fishing. So there's an assumption that they really want to reconnect with this because the story actually, shared by the family in Makassar as well.
And we know there are a significant number of Makassan burials in Northern Australia. So people... it was a very, any sort of maritime industry is a very risky industry. So people did occasionally die, and they were buried in Maragay in Australia. So of course that gets passed down through families, and people do want to come and visit and reconnect. So it's one of the funny things, in my opinion, that one of the earliest things that they actually, I guess one might say, collected for the National Australian Museum was, in fact, one of these quote-unquote illegal fishing boats, which almost certainly is indicative of these long-standing relationships between Northern Australian communities and Southeast Asia.
All right. Well, I think with that we might see if there's any questions from the audience. Yes, we have one up in the middle there. Just wait for the mic because we're recording. Thanks.
How was there exchange? Were the Aboriginal people paid for their work? Or was it, was it a commercial?
It's definitely a trade and exchange system. So people were trading all sorts of things, metal implements, they were fish hooks, pottery, glass, and Aboriginal people were then locating trepang for the Makassan fishers, so they would tell them where they could go and where they could find healthy crop of them.
So my second question is, why did the trepangers need the local people? And do you ever speculate about how this whole thing got started? Were the waters further north fished out and they kept going further south? And
a lot of it is overfishing, actually. There's really good evidence that the trade in trepang further to the west had started to, be impoverished because of overfishing. Unfortunately, the hyper-exploitation of the sea is nothing new.
So is there some sort of a verbal or a oral tradition that you can find in storytelling in Australian, in Aboriginal? This idea of myths or storytelling or passing down lore, there's nothing.
No, there's lots of stories about Makassans, lots and lots. And in fact, the song, the Bayini song, and the Bayini, I was in Yirrkala not very long ago, and somebody said to me they'd just recently seen the Bayini, the woman walking along the beach, and that has been going on for generation after generation. Lots of stories, and of course also if we think about rock art in particular as a sort of text, you also get recordings of
From
the
that,
prowls.
yeah. Thank you.
And in fact, that's reflected in some of the artworks in the exhibition as well. So in Gallery 2, you can see we have a number of bark paintings from the Yongnu areas that describe the coming of the Makassan prowls and the preparation of Trepang. They all post-date significantly the official cut-off of that relationship. So it shows the continuity of that history and that knowledge through the community's practice, even though it's kind of officially outlawed. So it continues to have a ceremonial presence or presence in the community as well. Would anybody else like to ask a question?
So on the word Bayini, I was wondering if you have more evidence of language exchange. Do Makassans use First Nations languages terms and vice versa? Are there Makassar words?
Thank you for that question. Linguistic evidence is very rich on this topic. So we have what we call borrow words or loan words that are right across Northern Australia, and indeed significant numbers of words in Indonesian languages, particularly in Makassar. The most recent one was a very recent discovery of only just a few months ago, when they realised that a particular word for a particular set of shading was in fact a reference to a shark that is only found in Northern Australia. So in fact, we're now thinking that people were possibly coming down and fishing for shark fin as well as everything else. So linguistic evidence is really a key part of what we're doing.
Yes, and for Yolngu language, because we've got this Yolngu Malta language here, there's at least 350 words that used on daily basis, everyday words in our Yolngu community. But interestingly, it's not only Makassan words, not Makassaris, but also Malay, so Indonesian. For example, money is rupiah, so it's coming from the our Indonesian money, rupiah. Bayini is a woman, and for flag, bandira. It comes from bendera. Father, they call it bapa. So there's so many other things that they, to smoke, because they loved whenever they, learning that, there's Makassan Pro coming. We're gonna have Dutch liquor, because they really like illegal Dutch alcohols back then, and kaluru. Kaluru means cigarettes. Yeah. So yeah, there's a lot of things.
I can just add to that. I think it's telling to know that the word for white people in Northern Australia is Ballanda, and Ballanda means Hollander, because the Dutch called Australia New Holland. So all of these linguistic terms indicates a rich interaction over many generations of Europeans, Southeast Asians and Northern Australia.
Any further questions from the audience? Yes, down here.
I'd just like to know from the, if I'm using the right word, culinary aspect, because there was once I saw a documentary that people in Anham land, they were cooking belacan, so did it come from Makassar?
In Darwin, there's a one media report. I think it's from ABC, and this actually article picked up by other global media network. So in Darwin, there are 3 Indonesian restaurants that very famous for sambal. So the chili paste. Now, this sambal it has to be sambal terasi. That's how we call our sambal, right? The terasi is the shrimp paste, or belacan, in Bahasa Melayu. So whenever they ask for belacan, it means that they ask for the sambal terasi, not the shrimp paste. But according to this, one of the restaurant owner, her parents, the parents of this restaurant owner actually told these stories about all these Makassans. They love everything with tamarind, yeah. So they put tamarind in their fish soups, in the sambals, and everything. Even the Campbell McKnight actually interestingly put in the Voyage to Marege's book saying that Makassar cook rice using tamarind. I said, no, never. We never cook our rice with tamarind, yeah. But we cook our fish soup with tamarind, just like in other Southeast Asian countries, yeah, in terms of culinary. So that's the tamarind. One of the research in our project now looking at the tamarind without putting the words tamarind trees, because in this history, people always keep telling us about tamarind trees, Makassar and tamarind trees. So I said to Lynette when I joined this project, I said, as a Makassan myself, I never actually think about tamarind trees. What I think about is tamarind, because we use tamarind every day. We don't really care about the trees. And I said, oh, this is different, because in Australia, one of the remarkable evidence that we keep looking at is the tamarind trees. Makassans introduced tamarind into Australia, but I think it's just accidentally, being there as a trees, because they stayed there for 4 or 5 months, and they brought a basket of tamarind balls, and it's enough. It's enough for them for their culinary purposes, right? So every time they brought a basket or 2 baskets of tamarinds, and I think because tamarinds is a type of plants that easy to grow in a kind of coastal settings, nature settings. So yeah, they grow there.
Also, yeah, because I also read many books like this that talked about the tamarind trees, and it was always the sense that they were planted.
No.
But you're suggesting they just grew.
Our research would actually indicate that Makassans did not plant the tamarind trees, that the tamarind seeds become incorporated into the soil in a variety of ways. People might throw them away and erosion and whatever, so that's how they begin, or birds indeed. But what I think what's really interesting is one of our affiliates has recently documented a very significant number of tamarind trees in the Burrarula Yanyuwa area, which the Yanyuwa people themselves have planted, and they planted them because they said they're such great trees, they're so shady. So they've moved them along from the coast and up one of the rivers. So botanical evidence is also one of the streams that we're looking at.
So maybe on that note, and to conclude, I just wanted to ask about your research project and kind of what is the final outcome of this collaborative project, and what are you hoping to present by the end?
Well, in my grandiose moments, I say that I want to change the way we think about Australian history, full stop. But the actual outputs of the project are a series of books. There will be, hopefully, there'll be a museum exhibition, and at the moment we're working on what we're calling a cultural gateway, which is a very significant interactive. It will be based on the IATSIS map, which I showed before, which is really problematic and it's got all sorts of mistakes in it, and we do know that. But it's kind of like a starting point. And that you will then be able to run your mouse over any of the coastal areas, and you'll be able to get up the stories that go with those areas, the contact stories, the encounter stories.
Wonderful. Well, something to look forward to. All right. Well, please join me in thanking our guests today for these wonderful presentations. And of course, I just want to give a gentle reminder about some of our upcoming programs as well. So if you missed the performance by Alec Topodi and the dance troupe from the Torres Strait Islands who have come to Singapore, they'll be performing again tomorrow at 2:30 in the Singapore Courtyard. And next week, we also have a very exciting artist visit. The artist Richard Bell will be in conversation with Eugene Tan next Saturday at the Embassy Tent. And then the exhibition itself, it's only got another 5 weeks to run, so make sure you come and visit. It'll be closing on September 25th. Okay, thank you so much for your kind attention today, and hope to see you again soon.